Hello and welcome to Portfolio Matters. In today's podcast, we will be looking at the basics of rare earth elements. What are they and which ones are useful and investors should be interested in? But before we do that, Richard will read the disclaimer.
Thank you, Keith. Everything discussed during the Portfolio Matters podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. Listeners should be aware that we will be discussing securities that we own or have a financial interest in. Please do your own research or consult a professional investment advisor before making any decisions regarding topics mentioned on the show. A full disclaimer can be found at the end. Okay, Keith.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, so this presentation will not mention any shares, and nor will it actually go into the market for rare earths. We will do a separate podcast on the rare earths market, but this podcast will just be talking about what rare earths are and which ones, what they're useful for, and which ones we should be interested in. So, why are we interested in rare earths? The basic answer is because they're going through the roof. The price of rare earth miners has shot up. Now, this is a company called Lynas Corporation, which is an Australian company, and they are the only company outside of China who can separate the elements, so provide pure neodymium or dysprosium. Most of the rare earth elements come out of China, so they're can be mined elsewhere in the world, and then they go to China for processing.
I think Lynas has recently been asked to set up a manufacturing unit plant in the US, hasn't it?
Right. I wasn't aware of that, but that would make sense. I mean, one of the things that people are very concerned about is the supply chain. As you will see as we go through this presentation, in 2011, China decided that it was going to stop exporting all rare earth elements, which caused an enormous spike in the share price. And as rare earths are now essential to a lot of high-tech goods, then obviously governments around the world are very concerned about security of supply. So what are rare earths? Well, they are at the bottom here. They're in row number 6 of the periodic table, and they're a series of heavy metals. And they can be split into 2 groups, light or heavy. And the reason they're split into 2 groups is they tend to be found in either one of those groups in the rock. So you either find all the light ones together or you find all the heavy ones together. Now, they're called rare earth elements not because they're necessarily very rare. They're actually named in the 19th century when the term earth referred to any element or substance that could not be reduced further by heat. So, for example, the chemists of the time thought that lime, which is calcium oxide, was an earth. So if we look at the abundance of these rare earths in the Earth's crust, the rare earths are highlighted in yellow. You'll see that cerium is the most abundant of them, and that's more abundant than copper. But neodymium, lanthanum, and yttrium are all quite abundant. They're more abundant than cobalt and lithium, both of which we kind of take for granted. And all of them are more common than gold, like substantially more common than gold. Okay, so what are they used for? Well, they have interesting electrical, optical, magnetic, and chemical properties. So they're used in LED lighting, in the glass industry. So the lens of your the zoom lens on your camera could be up to 50% lanthanum because it has a high refractive index. They're used in catalytic converters and batteries, and in particular in magnets. And as we see as we go through this, the most important use of rare earth elements is in magnets, particularly in electric motors, and so wind turbines use a hell of a lot of this. Now, the important thing about the sources of rare earth elements is there are two main types. There's either rock or there's clay. And so when you're looking at a company that claims to have a rare earth element resource, clays are best, because clays, it's very easy to get the rare earths out. All you have to do is wash the clay. There's rocks, it's much more difficult. So clays promise to be much easier and cheaper way of finding rare earths. Now, if we look at what the rare earths are used in, you'll see that lanthanum is mainly used in catalysts and batteries. So catalysts are 27,000 tons a year. The glass industry uses a lot of cerium. And it mainly uses cerium because cerium is a good abrasive. So it's not a high-tech use of cerium. There's some use in the metallurgical sector and the ceramics sector. But then the other main use is in permanent magnets. So neodymium iron boron magnets are the strongest commercially available magnets, and they are the main use of rare earths. Lanthanum is used in nickel metal hydride batteries, which are used, for example, in the Toyota Prius and hybrid vehicles. So using the data from that table, we can amalgamate how much of each element is used each year. So you can see commercially cerium is the most important, followed by lanthanum, neodymium, praseodymium. But
I think sorry to interrupt you. I think one of the issues with rare earths thing is the technology was sold to China, wasn't it? So chemically they're very similar to each other.
Yes.
And so the separation process is very complex, and that was actually bought by the Chinese when Western governments didn't appreciate the strategic importance of rare earths. So there are a couple of questions that occur to me, which is one, since the Chinese own the intellectual property of the separation technology, what's the deal in terms of setting up plants elsewhere in the world and using that technology? And the other one is that although you've listed the most frequently used, I think some of the rarer ones are used in very specific purposes where there is no substitution possible, aren't they? And so although you're looking at bulk there's also some which have very small but strategically highly important use.
Absolutely. So to answer your questions, Richard, first of all, in the case of China having a monopoly on the patents, I'm not sure that that's actually true. I mean, I will be doing a second video where I look at the market for it. But right. For example, Linus are clearly separating the rare earth elements. Yeah. But also, as we go through this, you'll see that you're right. Some of these smaller elements have very specific uses, but the demand compared to the supply, there's a lot more supply because people need neodymium, and you get all the others when you get neodymium because they tend to all be found in the rock or in the clay together. So the
economics of this is, it's not so much that they're rare, as you were saying, it's that most of the separation, 90% or so of the final refinement is done in China, and that's not a good thing.
Absolutely, that's right. So taking the elements one at a time, according to how much they're used, I mean, the annual production and consumption, cerium being the most important. Well, cerium is actually mainly used in the glass industry as an abrasive, but it has other uses. So it's one of only two metals, the other being iron, which makes a spark when struck. So mish metal is used in lighter flints. It's also used as a catalyst. It coats the wall of self-cleaning ovens. And then all the rare earth elements are used in pigments and in phosphorescence. So they each have slightly different properties. So this is the price history, and you'll see that all the price histories have this same enormous spike in 2011, when China announced a ban on the export of rare earth elements. And this lasted until they were taken to the World Trade Organization, who told them this was illegal. And so by 2014, prices had returned to normal. And you'll see on this graph, which is provided by Statista, that there are discontinuities in the timeline. So you jump from 2011, where there's this huge spike, to 2016 is the next data point. But you will see that the price of cerium is going nowhere and is forecast to actually decline over the next 5 years. The next most used rare earth is neodymium, and the conclusion of this presentation will be that investors should only actually be concerned with neodymium. So neodymium iron boron magnets were discovered in 1983 and are the strongest commercially available magnets. And so they were essential to the miniaturization of many household electronics. Anything which requires a speaker or a small motor, and they're now an essential part of electric car motors and wind turbines. And as we go through this, you'll see a big wind turbine uses an enormous amount of neodymium. A 2 megawatt wind turbine uses about 200 kilograms.
Is there any data, Keith, on the actual future demand of neodymium?
Well, we will go through that, and there are forecasts, Richard, but I question the forecasts.
Right.
So there's also used in tanning booths because neodymium will allow UV light through, but not blocks infrared.
Right.
Now, when we talk about wind turbines, the amount of neodymium used in a wind turbine is really astonishing. So this table actually comes from 2014 AMEC study. And at that time, a 7 megawatt wind turbine, which obviously is a very large one, used up to 1.3 tons of neodymium. Now, technology may have advanced and they may have become more efficient, but the order of magnitude is enormous. These are very large numbers of a rare element.
So where did neodymium come in the rarity table, Keith?
It was
or the rarity of rarity.
Yeah, well, it's one of the most common. So I think it's about 40. We can go up. So here it's 41.5. It's just below copper.
So basically, once the West gets its manufacturing and its refining facilities sorted out, the price is going to plummet, isn't it? Because the Chinese will be making this stuff and will be making it. It's not actually particularly rare, and so at some point we're in a mining cycle, aren't we?
we are.
Slightly odd mining cycle, where we've now reached a point where there's massive investment at the bottom at sort of 6 o'clock, I guess. And it's not just because of price, it's also because of security concerns.
Exactly. That's right.
You know, at 9 o'clock or whatever, suddenly the market's going to realize it's saturated. So the opportunity lies between now and the point when all these plants come to fruition, however long they take to build.
Well, the other thing, you raise a very valid point, Richard, because when we go back up and look at the annual consumption of neodymium, it was 23,000 tons. Now, and bearing in mind its abundance in the earth crust is 41 compared to copper's 60.
Yeah.
Now, the consumption of copper is 20 million tons a year.
Yeah.
So clearly there is a lot of scope to increase the production of neodymium.
Yeah. Interesting. So it's not a buy and hold investment, is it, by the sound of it? Or you might buy and hold it for 2 or 3 years, but you might not.
Well,
you want to be careful.
I think we need to hold off on discussing the economics until I've done the second video, because I know they're very difficult to separate.
Yeah.
Because all of these rare earth elements are very similar in chemical properties.
Yes.
So separating them is quite involved.
Yeah.
Anyway, so why is neodymium used in wind turbines? And the reason is that initially in wind turbines, there was a big gearbox that converted the speed with which the rotor turned to the speed at which the generator required. But these failed regularly. And so there's a weight and a maintenance issue. And offshore, obviously, if you have an offshore wind turbine, you don't want the gearbox failing.
Yeah.
So they've developed these direct drive turbines, which gets rid of the gearbox. And the neodymium is used in that generator. Now, there are lots of very good videos on YouTube, if anyone is interested, which shows how the direct drive turbines work. But anyway, the bottom line is that using direct drive gets rid of the gearbox, but it means that if neodymium were ever to get to an absurd price, you could simply switch back to using gearboxes.
Yeah.
So there is a ready substitution there.
Yes.
Now this is the size of a modern wind turbine, and when we talk about 1.4 tons of neodymium,
it's enormous.
Yeah, absolutely. That you can see at the top this little man, which gives you a sense of the scale of one of these direct drive turbines.
And this is a thing mounted in the pod at the top of the tower.
Exactly. So these historic prices and forecasts. Now, currently, their supply and demand are forecast to be in balance with a slight surplus of supply. But there are lots of forecasts saying that because of the growth in wind turbines, that the market will move into deficit.
Do we know what the above ground stocks are, Keith?
I don't, sorry. Now, this chart purports to show the forecast demand for neodymium going forward, but I'm singly unconvinced by this. This is from Statista.
Doesn't look right, does it?
It just looks like somebody's put in, 3% growth from now on. Whereas historically, you can see it's been running at least, close to 10% growth. And given
we know that wind turbines are being put up with increasing frequency, they're getting bigger, and they prefer the direct drive because it's cheaper maintenance and also a more efficient method of generating electricity. So you would expect this a slight exponential growth here to continue, wouldn't you?
Absolutely.
For a while.
Yep. So I suspect this graph substantially understates expected demand growth. Okay, so moving on, the next one is lanthanum. Now, lanthanum is used in hydrogen vehicles. Basically, lanthanum nickel alloy is used to store the hydrogen. The hydrogen is in the interstices within the alloy. It's also used in hybrid vehicles. So Toyota Prius has 15 to 20 kilograms of lanthanum in the battery. As I mentioned earlier, it's used in camera lenses. The lens of a digital camera can be up to 50% lanthanum. However, nickel metal hydride batteries are larger and heavier than lithium-ion batteries, but they are slower to charge and discharge, and they have more of a memory effect. So they don't like to be half charged, and they're old technology, basically. Right. Now that their lithium-ion batteries have benefited from economies of scale due to mass manufacture, lithium-ion is cheaper. So I think nickel metal hydride batteries are old technology, and I'd expect demand for lanthanum from that source, one of their main sources of demand, to decline. Hence, I think the only rare earth element as you should be concerned about as an investor is neodymium.
They tend to be, obviously they might tend to be mined together and then separated, so it suggests there's going to be large quantities of lanthanum knocking around that nobody wants, doesn't it? Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure exactly whether lanthanum is found with neodymium. If you look at the...
Are they both heavy?
I'm not sure. Let me go back up. So lanthanum is found with neodymium, yes. Yeah. But if you look at the actual profiles of individual mines, you'll see that the concentrations of each element varies quite a lot between different mines.
Okay.
So the next one is Praseodymium. Now, praseodymium is also used in magnets. Praseodymium and Dysprosium are added to neodymium iron boron magnets to improve corrosion resistance and their intrinsic coercivity, which means their ability to hold their magnetic polarity and not be demagnetized by the Earth's magnetic field.
Okay.
It's also used in tiny quantities, but very important quantities, in fiber optics as a signal amplifier.
Okay.
Now, praseodymium is forecast to increase in price over the coming years. Right, so what is the supply situation? And this graph looks at recycling. Is there any recycling of rare earth elements?
Right.
And the answer is no, not currently. It all goes into landfill, unfortunately.
Because it's difficult to recycle, expensive?
Absolutely, that's right. Basically, nobody has set up a system for doing it. There are various companies which are now promising to do so. A company called Urban Mining and Geomega Resources are both startups in the US that are aiming to establish facilities to do this. Right. But if you think about the original supply, you get a solution of the salts of rare earth elements, and then you just have to separate those salts. Yeah. But when it finally gets into a battery, you then have to crush the mobile phone and extract the relevant bit, all of which is messy and unpleasant and very technically difficult to do.
Yeah, and creates a lot of waste byproduct, or else it's very time consuming to separate it out mechanically from the bits you don't want.
Yeah.
I would imagine that a wind turbine magnet would be relatively easy to recycle.
Yes.
Concentrated material and easily separable. As you
Yeah.
say, a mobile phone battery or
Yes.
something similar, a speaker magnet would be very difficult to do.
Well, also, as the market for neodymium increases, there should be more of the scrap, and it becomes more, worthwhile doing.
Yeah.
Setting up a separate facility to do it.
Yeah.
So this chart table looks at what the composition of a neodymium iron boron magnet is. So it's about 30% neodymium, 65% iron, and then everything else is essentially trace. Boron's 1%. You'll see praseodymium isn't even mentioned here.
Yeah.
Because you can substitute in neodymium or dysprosium. So the only rare earth element of importance, as far as I can see, is neodymium. Now, the other element we've talked about in regards to the batteries, but actually haven't covered, is dysprosium. But the thing is, dysprosium is often found as a byproduct when you're looking for neodymium, and it's found in the Earth crust at a ratio of 8 parts neodymium to 1 dysprosium. But its use in magnets is only about 1/3 to 1/4 of that.
Right.
So whenever you're looking for neodymium, you will find more than enough dysprosium.
Yeah.
So for investors, I don't think that's really of very much interest. And in conclusion, neodymium is the most intensively used of the rare earth elements, and it's the only one we need to focus on.
That's very interesting, Keith. A nice, neat conclusion from the analysis, actually, where you go through all of them and work out that actually the one that is in short supply because of the high demand for it, in terms of the quantity that's required, is neodymium. And almost all the rest of them then become byproducts, don't they?
Exactly.
Cheaper byproducts of the main product.
Exactly. That's right. So we will be doing another presentation next week on the market for neodymium and rare earth elements. And I'll be looking into the question that Richard raised of whether China has a monopoly on the patents for separating these elements.
I would say, even if it has, I suspect that from a security point of view, other countries would simply ignore that patent, those patent rights.
Yes.
We shall see.
Okay. So, thank you all for listening. I hope you'll press like and subscribe to the channel, and we hope to see you again soon. So it's goodbye from Richard Rita.
And thank you very much for the presentation, Keith. It's very interesting.
Good.
And it's goodbye from Keith Jordan. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Full disclaimer. The material and information contained in this podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only and should not be relied upon for making a business, legal or any other decision. We may own or have a financial interest in any securities mentioned. Listeners should conduct their own research or consult a professional investment advisor before making any decisions regarding topics mentioned on the show. Whilst we endeavour to ensure that the information presented on the show is correct, we make no representations or warranties of any kind, express or implied, with respect to the podcast and website or to any information, products, services or related graphics discussed or presented in the podcast or website. Any reliance you place on such material is strictly at your own risk. You are solely responsible for the investment decisions you make. We will not be responsible for any errors or omissions in the podcast or website, including in articles or postings, for hyperlinks embedded in messages, or for any results obtained from the use of such information. Nor will we be liable for any loss or damage, including consequential damages, if any, caused by a reader's reliance on any information provided by the podcast or website. Please do not listen to the podcast if you do not accept self-responsibility for your actions.